All right, so you wanted a deep dive into British English, right? Well, get ready because we're diving deep. And let me tell you, it's way more than just a charming accent and sprinkling a U in color here and there.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, we use this term British English, but it's almost misleading when you think about it.
How so?
Because it's not just one thing. It's this incredible tapestry of accents and dialects, influences upon influences over centuries.
So not one correct way to speak it, huh? Which, now that you mention it, some of the sources we got for this were incredible. Linguistic studies, historical accounts, even some fun facts about slang that I'm sure we'll get into.
Oh, definitely.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's rewind a bit. Way back. How did this whole British English even come to be?
Well, picture the British Isles over 1,500 years ago. You've got Celtic languages hanging around, a little bit of Roman influence left over, but then come the Anglo-Saxons with their own dialects, and that's really the bedrock of it all, those Germanic influences.
So it's a mix and match language basically right from the start.
Oh, for sure. And then, just to add to the mix, you have the Vikings show up, speaking Old Norse, another Germanic language, and they leave their own mark on the language's grammar and vocabulary. But if we're talking about major turning points, it has to be the Norman conquest in 1066.
Okay, yeah, the Normans. History buff hat on here. They were the French-speaking invaders, right? It's like a whole new language invited itself over for dinner.
Exactly. And what a feast of linguistic fusion it was. Because Norman French, that became the language of the courts, of law, high society, you name it. You can almost hear the clash of cultures and languages playing out, between those who had the power and, well, everyone else.
Which we still see today in the language. One of our sources had this great example. Swine versus pork. Blew my mind.
Isn't it amazing? Swine, from the Old English, likely used by, people who actually raise the animals. But pork, that comes from the French pork. And that was the word used by the people eating the roast at the table, not the ones tending the sty. Language as a social hierarchy, baked right in.
That is wild. Okay, I'm never looking at a pork pie the same way again. But seriously, you're right. It's like this whole hidden history lesson in our everyday words.
Exactly. And this mingling of Anglo-Saxon and Norman French, it gives us Middle English. Think Chaucer, but way harder to understand, even for us.
Oh, absolutely. Even for native English speakers, reading Middle English can feel like you're deciphering another language.
But that just goes to show that British English, even way back then, it wasn't this fixed, rigid thing. It was already branching out, developing its own quirks.
Which leads us to the big question. How did one dialect out of all those variations end up as what we think of as standard English? Was it by design or a total accident? So last time we took a trip through time, through linguistic history, Anglo-Saxons, Normans, the whole shebang, and we saw how British English, even way back then, it was already this fascinating kind of melting pot of influences, right?
Definitely.
But we left off on that big question, how did one dialect out of all those variations out there rise to become what we think of today as standard English?
It's really tempting to think that someone somewhere just decided, this is it. This is the correct way to speak English. Everyone else, fall in line.
Right, like some official decree or something?
Exactly. But it wasn't quite as orchestrated as that. It's more about influence. Certain hubs, certain cities, they just naturally become these trendsetters, even in language.
And in this case, it seems like London was, I don't know, maybe the biggest trendsetter of them all. All of our sources kind of pointed to London playing this huge role.
Oh, absolutely. By the late Middle Ages, London was the place to be, a center for power, for commerce, the works. And so the dialect spoken there, this blend of Southern and Midland influences, it started to gain, prestige.
It's like the language of opportunity, right? If you want to get ahead, you've got to speak the language of London.
Exactly. And then another game changer, the printing press shows up in the 15th century. Now, imagine the impact of that.
Huge.
Before that, everything's handwritten, variations everywhere. But with the printing press, boom, you can suddenly mass produce a text in one specific dialect.
And no surprise, those early printers in London, they went with the, what do you call it? The local flavor.
Yeah, you could say that. But seriously, whether they were consciously trying to standardize the language or just make their own lives a bit easier, it had a huge ripple effect. Because as more and more people encountered this printed form of English, in books, pamphlets, even official documents, it became the benchmark.
The English of education, of government.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So standard English.
Yeah.
It wasn't born from some grand plan, but by the power of the printing press. Who knew, right?
Wild. But even with that standard emerging, you still had and have this incredible tapestry of accents all across the UK. I mean, our sources barely even scratched the surface. Geordie, Scouse, Cockney. I mean, it's like a whole world of sound.
And I think that speaks to just how deeply rooted language is in regional identity. It's not just about how you speak, but where you're from, the communities you belong to. It's part of who you are.
100%. And thank goodness for that diversity, right?
Absolutely.
Speaking of regional quirks, though, one source mentioned how the word though, Though, it had like almost 500 different spellings in the 15th century. 500.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it? But it just goes to show you, language isn't this fixed thing. It's fluid, always changing, always evolving.
And that's even before we add in things like, I don't know, immigration and globalization and all these incredible influences that shape how a language, well, how it sounds, how it feels.
Exactly. And it makes you think about those things we label as correct or incorrect in language in a whole new light.
Which leads us to something I've always wondered about, received pronunciation, you know, that whole BBC English thing. Is that truly the correct way to speak British English, or is that just another layer in this whole, like, language myth?
It's a really loaded question, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's wrapped up in history, social baggage, you name it. Received pronunciation, or RP for short. It really emerged in the 19th century, and it became associated with education, with a certain social standing. And yeah, the BBC, especially in its early days, it did play a role in, solidifying that connection in a lot of people's minds.
So the media, even back then, shaping how we think about, proper speech?
To some extent, for sure. But here's the crucial thing, RP. It's an accent. Just one accent among many. It's not inherently superior to any other accent, even if it's been, perceived that way for a long time.
And thankfully, things are changing. I mean, you hear a much wider range of accents on the BBC now, on TV, in movies, everywhere, really.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the sources you sent, it talked about the emergence of multicultural London English, or MLE.
Okay, MLE, I gotta admit, that one's new to me. Tell me more.
It's a fairly recent phenomenon, but it just shows how dynamic British English continues to be. MLE, it's this vibrant blend, this fusion of influences from all the languages that are spoken in London today.
Wow.
Yeah. It borrows from Caribbean dialects, West African languages, South Asian languages, you name it. It's like London itself, constantly changing, evolving.
So from regional dialects to this incredible mix of global influences, British English is anything but static.
100%.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I'm dying to dig into those regional accents a bit more. We've got to give our listeners a little taste of those sonic differences, right?
You're right. What better way to illustrate the point? And where better to start than with the classic North-South divide?
All right, so we were talking British English accents, and last we left off, you're about to give us the, what did you call it? The sonic lowdown on the North-South divide.
Right. Well, you can't talk about British English accents without talking about vowel sounds. They're really the biggest giveaway, right?
Yeah.
And up north, you're going to hear those long vowels, nice and clear. That E sound like in sea, or that oo sound in moon. And you'll hear that even in words like go or say. But you head down south, and those same vowels, they'll start to shift. They become diphthongs. They get a little glide to them.
So is that a real thing or just a stereotype, that whole someone from London saying gow instead of go?
Oh, it's definitely real, 100%. And it's not just about like individual vowels in isolation. It's how they change and play off each other within a word. That's where you get into things like T-glottalization.
Okay, T-glottalization. See, now you're just using the big words. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
But seriously, what is T-glottalization?
No, it sounds very technical, but It's actually really common. You probably do it yourself and you don't even realize it. Basically, it's when that T sound, particularly at the end of a word or just before a vowel, it gets swapped for this sort of like stop in the throat, a mini pause, almost.
So like bottle becomes bottle?
Yeah.
Okay, I can hear that.
Right. Or water becomes water.
Yeah. Yeah.
It used to be considered like a Cockney thing, but you hear it everywhere now, especially more casual speech. And that's the thing about language. It's always on the move, always picking up these new habits and sounds.
And speaking of Cockney, we can't not talk about the dropped R. That's like British English 101, right? Or is that another stereotype we need to unpack?
It's definitely a very noticeable feature, I'd say, of certain accents. But again, it all comes down to where you are on those British Isles.
Yeah.
Because, in a lot of England and Wales, that R sound at the end of a syllable, or if it comes before a consonant, it just kind of goes on holiday.
Yeah.
And the vowel before it gets stretched out a bit.
So like car becomes ka. And sugar becomes sugar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. But then you go up north, and that R, it's back, which just goes to show you, even within this thing we call British English, you have this incredible amount of sonic variety.
It really is amazing. And we haven't even touched on things like differences in vocabulary and grammar, which, I mean, I'm sure we could spend hours going down those rabbit holes.
Oh, absolutely. Hours and hours.
But for now, let's, I don't know, zoom out a bit. Look at that bigger global picture, because British English has had this incredible journey, right? It's influenced how English is spoken in so many different parts of the world.
Yeah, you can't really overstate the historical factors there, right? I mean, the British Empire, colonialism, English spread far and wide, but it didn't stay the same. Wherever it went, it kind of took root and absorbed local influences and flavors. Just think about like all the different varieties of Commonwealth English out there.
You're talking Australia, India, South Africa, places that already had their own incredibly rich histories, their own languages, their own, I don't know, linguistic tapestries already in place.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. You have British English as this kind of foundation, but then these distinct accents, unique vocabulary, different grammatical structures even, they emerge. It's a beautiful illustration of how language is alive, how it adapts, how it reflects the people who are actually using it.
And especially in our globalized world, that dynamic just feels more relevant than ever, doesn't it? I mean, with the internet, social media, British English is constantly bumping up against all these other languages, all these other ways of speaking.
All the time. And I think it's really interesting because it's where those mistakes that people make, not mistakes in a judgmental way, but you know what I mean? They become so fascinating.
Right, because it shows how we're using language.
Yes,
Yeah.
because it shows how people are playing with language, molding it, making it fit their needs.
It's not about clinging to this like rigid idea of, you know, this is the right way to speak.
Yes,
It's about celebrating the creativity
absolutely.
and the evolution.
Yes, 100%. And for anyone listening out there who's learning British English, honestly, don't be afraid to experiment, to listen, to make the language your own. That's where the real joy of language is.
What a fantastic note to end on. So from linguistic history to the myth of correct British English, we've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully you've even picked up a new accent or two along the way. But I think the biggest takeaway here is that British English, just like any living, breathing language, it's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving, it's being shaped by the people who speak it, by the world around it, and honestly, who knows what it will sound like, how it will be spoken a century from now. What new words, new slang, new pronunciations will emerge? Well, I guess that's a deep dive for another day.